Good to see you tonight. Open your Bibles and put your bookmark, please, in Mark chapter 9. Bill, I gave you the wrong passage, but I'm using that passage anyway, so it all worked out good. So Mark chapter 9 is where we'll be studying from tonight. Glad to see you. Appreciate you being here. I know there are a lot of things that vie for your attention, especially this evening. Gavin did a wonderful job at the table today, especially some of his comments this morning, and addressed the appeal of the Super Bowl. And I'm going to tell you, it's hard to get up and preach Super Bowl evening because here in about 10 minutes, especially in the digital age, half the folks in the church with their Apple Watches, they're going to start doing this right here. So I do get it. I understand there are a lot of things that vie for our attention. It's an encouragement to me to have you here, so I appreciate you being here. Elders made an announcement this morning concerning one of our brethren. I have an address that we're going to put on the bulletin board in the back if you want to write to that individual. So please take note of that after services this evening. As you go through the ministry of Jesus and you read through the Gospels, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, there are a lot of the miracles that Jesus does that they're just impressive. I think if we were there and we happen to be able to see Jesus do some of the things that he did, I think we would probably react the way that many of those people reacted. That they were overwhelmed, they were amazed, they were glorifying God, they were saying things like that. We've never seen anything like this in Israel. Surely this has to be the Son of God. And as you consider those things and the impact that they had, while we didn't see them, and as a result, maybe we don't have the same kind of visceral response that they did, I think for us, the advantage we have is we get to see the bigger picture and why Jesus was doing those things. As Jesus would come into town and begin teaching or have the opportunity to do a miracle, and crowds would start forming, and then there's the opportunity to do more miracles. I think for a lot of those people, they didn't stop and ask, why are you doing this? But we get to see that. What we see in the miracles of Jesus is the disposition of God. One of the things that impresses me about his miracles is that nearly all of his miracles, with the exception of a very few, had an end. And the end was to help somebody. He was curing people from illnesses. He was raising people from the dead. He was casting out demons. And those are impressive things because they help us to appreciate the character of God. That he didn't just come to put on a show. He came to show us that he cares about us. And the things that he did, even in evidence of his authority, he did to show that he is good and he wants to help us. And so while we look at the miracles as evidentiary, Jesus did many other things, John tells us, that are not written. These are written that you might believe. The reality is what we see in miracles is the goodness of God. But there are some of the miracles that I find particularly curious. And that's what I want to talk with you about this evening. I think some of the miracles Jesus did very intentionally. Matthew chapter 9, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, when they let the man down, the paralyzed man, through the tiling in the roof, and Jesus takes advantage of the opportunity and says, "Son, be of good cheer, your sins are forgiven." Jesus takes advantage of that circumstance in order to teach a very important point. It was a peculiar miracle in that regard. And I think you see that from time to time. John chapter 6, the feeding of the 5,000, John's record of that goes on to have Jesus talking about the significance of being the bread of life. That like Moses gave manna, so God gave the bread of life now that you might have spiritual life. And so there are times when some of the miracles of Jesus are particularly pointed. John chapter 9, the healing of the blind man, when Jesus is asked, who sinned? Is it this man or his parents? And Jesus' reply, no, that the works of God might be shown in him. And there is quite the to-do between the blind man and the Pharisees, and it is a particular circumstance. In Mark chapter 9, and the parallels are in each of the synoptics. And so the parallels are in Matthew chapter 17 and in Luke chapter 9. Jesus has been on the Mount of Transfiguration with Peter, James, and John. He comes down from the mountain. And when he comes down to the mountain and he's in the region of Caesarea Philippi, there is a crowd gathered around his apostles. And the reading begins, the other apostles, the other 9. The reading begins at verse 14 of Mark chapter 9. Okay? When he came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them and scribes disputing with them. Immediately when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed and running to him greeted him. And he asked the scribes, "What are you discussing with them?" And one from the multitude answered and said, "Teacher, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit. And whenever he seizes him, he throws him down. He foams at the mouth and gnashes his teeth and becomes rigid." By the way, in Matthew's account, what he says is he is epileptic. But keep that in mind. And he says, "So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast him out, but they could not." And he answered and said, "O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me." And they brought him to him, and when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him. He fell on the ground, he wallowed, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked the Father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And often he's thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw the people come running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to him, "You deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more." And the spirit cried out, convulsing him greatly, and he came out of him, and he became as one dead, so that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast him out?" And he said to them, "This kind can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting." I've been reading this miracle all my life. And I will confess to you that for most of my life, it's been a puzzle to me. Now, not the details. It's fairly easy and straightforward to see what's going on. The puzzle to me is always, why is this miracle here? Well, why does God tell us about this particular circumstance, this particular child, this particular man, this particular time? And the fact that it's in all three of the Gospels, I always find to be a significant thing. So let's talk a little bit about possibly what God intends for us to understand, and some things that I think we can understand. Whether or not it was God's intention, I do not know. But here's some things I see from this miracle that I find very, very compelling. And the first one is this. What you see in this circumstance, in this miracle, is that there are circumstances and problems in life that are much greater than others. This is a kind of an unusual circumstance as far as what we see. It's not unusual in that you have someone who is demon-possessed, but it is unusual in everything going on around it and the fact that the apostles can't cast this demon out. And I want you to appreciate that that's exactly what's happening. Matthew's account, and I mentioned a moment ago, reads that he was epileptic. But as you read the other accounts, and even in Matthew's, there's much more than epilepsy that's going on here. Verses 17 and 18 in our reading, he has a mute spirit. Whenever he, that is the Spirit, seizes him, I spoke to your disciples, but they couldn't cast him out. Verse 20, when they brought him, that is the child, to him, and when he, either the child or the Spirit, and I think he's talking about the Spirit here. When he sees him, when he sees Jesus, immediately the Spirit convulsed him. Verse 22, he has often thrown him into the fire, and Jesus rebukes in verse 25, "You deaf and dumb spirit, I command you." Demon possession in the Bible is very curious, isn't it? I don't have all the answers. This is one of those questions that you get as a teacher or a preacher pretty regularly from folks. In fact, I got a text message not 2 weeks ago from someone saying, "Do you believe that there's demon possession today?" And my answer to that question is no, I do not. But I do believe that's what's going on in biblical times. And we can talk about why the change. In the short version is, I think when God ceased giving man powers that were beyond the ordinary, that he ceased giving Satan leeway at the same time. But that's for another discussion. What I want you to appreciate about this is the people involved and how they must have seen it. Have you ever thought about this child? We don't know how old the child is. When Jesus asks how long it's been going on, the man says from childhood. So I'm thinking that this child has to be a little bit older. Do you think the child wondered what was happening to him? Why this is happening to him? They live in a day, and especially from his parents' perspective, they live in a day where very often they associated difficulties or tragedies or diseases with some kind, especially among the Jews, some kind of moral failing. If you go over to John 9, Jesus and his apostles are walking into the temple, and there's a blind man there, and the apostles ask him, who sinned? Was it this man or was it his parents? And I got to thinking about that. Can you imagine what this family dealt with, dealing with a child that they recognized not only showed the normal symptoms of epilepsy, but that this child some way or another, somehow or another, for some reason or another, had been possessed by Satan? I propose to you that the difficulty that they faced in their life went far beyond the physical symptoms, because they had to grapple with the why. How many nights do you think this father laid in bed and wondered what he had done? What did I do, God, that brought this on my child? What did my child do? He's just a kid. How could he have done anything so horrible that this is what he's living with? And how do we live with it? How do we make sense of this? I wish I knew the answers to those questions. I think it's an abnormal circumstance. Maybe like the man in a few chapters earlier that Jesus meets that has a legion of demons in him. But here's what I want you to appreciate about this. Now, we don't always have all the answers to circumstances in life. If Ecclesiastes teaches us anything, it teaches us that life under the sun can be very unfair. It can be very unjust. Time and chance happens to everyone. Everybody dies. Sometimes you don't die when you think you should die. Sometimes you die and you leave wealth that you've worked hard for, and that's unfair. And sometimes people are led by folks that shouldn't be leading. And if there's anything that Solomon rages about in Ecclesiastes, it is that life is simply unfair, and sometimes we have to deal with that. And having the answer to why doesn't really necessarily change it. Now, here's the application. I see a lot of folks in my life, and you see a lot of folks in your life, that deal with circumstances that just seem to me to be terribly unfair. David talked this morning about marriage and divorce and God's law. I've known a number of people that were on the receiving end of marital difficulties who worked really, really hard in their marriage. If their spouse had, as far as I could tell, if their spouse had offered equal effort, they would have had a godly marriage, but they didn't. And so sometimes godly people suffer as a result of ungodly people and the things that they do. Sometimes we suffer in our physical health. And there's not really a way to figure out why that happened. You go into the doctor and they'll ask you, is there a history of heart disease? Is there a history of cancer? Is there a history of this kind of issue? Is there a history of colon problems? And no. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, you got heart problems, colon problems, and cancer problems. And you think, wait a minute, how did that happen? This makes no sense to me. And I'm going to tell you what happens in those kinds of circumstances. Our trust is tested in ways that normal problems don't test our trust. Sometimes things, in spite of our best efforts, are just a lot worse for us. And I think that's what's happening here. And the man doesn't have any answers. And the apostles don't have any answers. In fact, the apostles can't even fix it. Even Jesus, when they asked him, why couldn't we cast him out? I said, well, this kind. There's something about this kind. I don't know why. This kind, you got to have some extra work here. There's going to have to be prayer and fasting to an extent that you are unaccustomed to. And so I want you to appreciate that there are times in life and circumstances in life that are just beyond the norm difficult. The question is, what do you do with that? And you can fill in the blanks. I have a couple of friends who have post-traumatic stress disorder. Some because of military service and things that they saw, some because of trauma that they experienced as children. And I have talked with them and prayed with them and listened to them, and I don't always have answers. I don't know why this happened to you. I don't know why it has unhinged your mind the way that it has. And I watch these people and I see the emotions and I see the frustration, I see the hopelessness, and I see the helplessness. And some of you in this audience deal with some of that in your life in one way or another, don't you? What do you do with that? I think the question that the disciples ask in verse 28, why couldn't we fix it? Well, here's the challenge, it seems to me. When Jesus tells them this can come out by nothing but prayer and fasting, I think He's challenging them and maybe challenging us to a reliance that's greater than we thought ourselves possible of offering. Because sometimes the only thing you can do with a problem you can't explain, that you can't face, that leaves you hopeless and helpless and impotent, the only thing you can do is trust more. And I pray that most folks in this audience never have to deal with that kind of circumstance, but some of you already do, and the chances are pretty good that some of us will at some point in time, and we're faced with this. How come I can't fix this? Well, some things just require more from you. I know that's not necessarily comforting on its face, but I want you to appreciate what that says is God recognizes these kinds of issues. God recognizes that there are these kinds of demons that we have to deal with. And so you have this circumstance. Now here's my second observation. There's not any obstacle that Jesus can't overcome. Just because this demon was exceptional in some way or another, and I don't know how. What I do see is when the apostles can't cast him out and Jesus walks up, do you notice the reaction of the child of the demon? When they bring him to Jesus, what does he do? Buddy, he puts on his best display of his power. He throws the child down. The child is without control. He's foaming at the mouth. He's walling. I'm sure it's scaring everybody to death. And I think the demon's just saying, look what I can do, and you can't fix it, and they couldn't stop me. And I think that's an image that you need to see here. But the response of Jesus, beginning in verse 25, is, deaf and dumb spirit, I command you to come out from him. Do you appreciate the significance of the authority of Jesus? When he says in Matthew chapter 28 and verse 18, all authority is given to me in heaven and on earth. I'm going to tell you, most of the time we use that and we immediately go to having authority for the things that we do and teach. And I think that's a good use of the concept. But this is a concept that goes far beyond, do we have authority for singing as opposed to instrumental music? Do we have authority for how we deal with marriage and divorce? Do we have authority for what we do with our money? Yes, all of that is involved in the idea of all authority is given to me in heaven and on earth. But it goes much greater than that. All authority means that Jesus can tell anybody anything and they have to obey. Animate, inanimate. Now this will blow your mind. You start thinking about it very much. If Jesus told this podium to move, this podium would move. You say, well, how does that work? I don't know. But that's what we understand about the authority of Jesus. He calmed the sea. Sea obeyed him. Sea is inanimate. He stopped the winds obeyed him. The wind is inanimate. He walked on water. That's physically in regards to the material universe that God designed and the laws that govern it. That is impossible to do. But Jesus could defy all of that because He has the authority that when He commands things, things have to obey. That's why on the last day, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. Whether you want to or not, whether you believe or not, that's exactly what you're going to do. And that has a lot of implications. It says that Satan and his minions have to obey. When Jesus condemns Satan, Satan will be condemned. Rest assured, he will have no choice when Jesus exercises his authority to that extent. When He destroys this world, the world will be destroyed as surely as it was created, because when God speaks, everything in existence has to obey, which means if God says your sins are forgiven, your sins are forgiven. Even moral reality is subject to the authority of God. If God says you are clean, then rest assured you are clean. If God tells your dead body to rise, rest assured your dead body will rise. If God decides to change your body from physical to spiritual, rest assured that resurrection and that change will happen. And the practical implication of all that is that dealing with these circumstances in life that are harder than normal, I've got an emotional issue. My mind doesn't work right. I don't know what you do with that. I don't know how many. I just was asked this question the other day. What do you think about people that, that have mental issues, mental health issues? And I don't know, but God does. All I know is that God tells us to do what He asks us to do in regards to the things that we can do. But what I also know is God has the power to take care of all that. He had the power to cast out this demon. His disciples couldn't do it. Nobody else could do it. The demon was powerful and overpowering, and yet there's nothing too powerful and overpowering for God to take care of, which means you and I can deal with pretty much anything with the help of our Lord. We're studying Hebrews right now in chapter 2 and chapter 4, both. End with a reminder that we have a high priest who can sympathize, who lived as a man who was tempted like we are, and that we can come boldly, chapter 4 says, we can come boldly to the throne of grace and mercy and find help in time of need. Well, we need to take advantage of that. And you say, yeah, but prayer doesn't fix the problem. But prayer helps you deal with the problem. And we need to appreciate that some problems may not be fixable. It doesn't mean that life is hopeless. And that's a hard thing for people. We want it easy. We want it to be fixed. We want our child healed. We want our disease to go away. We want the challenges to be dismissed. We want the struggles, the emotional struggles, the mental struggles. We want to overcome them all so we don't have to deal with them anymore. And we forget sometimes that the Lord makes some promises to us no matter what the problem is. He won't allow us to be tempted beyond what we're able. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. That's an important thing. That says that you're capable of dealing with this. Because God has the power to fix it. Whether it's now, whether it's eternal, He has the power, and that's where your confidence needs to be. There's a passage. I want you to flip over to this one. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 1 right quick. This is a passage that gives me a whole lot of hope and comfort, even though it's not something that jumps out as obvious to us. In 1 Peter chapter 1, Peter's talking about God being blessed because He's fathered us again in verses 3 and 4. I want you to notice verse 5. 1 Peter 1 and verse 5 says, who, that is talking about us who are the heirs, who have been born again or fathered again. who are kept by the power of God through faith for salvation. The word keep there is a kind of a peculiar word. Literally it means to set a watch in advance, to set a guard, or to encompass. And as I understand it in the context, what God's telling us is, look, I've already encircled you, who are my kids, who are my children. And I'm already watching for you. My guard is set, and as long as your faith is what it ought to be, I am taking care of you. Now, I'm not going to take that to the sense that, okay, you've got a guardian angel. If you run off the road, you're going to be miraculously saved from a car wreck. I don't think that's the idea. I think the idea is for those who live their lives in faith in God, God is watching and caring and making sure that we can deal with the life that we have. Even though, like Paul, we may not get deliverance. And this is where I think faith comes in. Remember Paul in 2 Corinthians 12 prays that the thorn of his flesh might be removed? You remember that? Shake your head, yes, or I'll spend more time. Okay? And what does God tell him? Basically, God says, no, I'm not going to remove that. My strength is perfected in your weakness, he says. And what Paul comes to appreciate is that because of whatever he's suffering, that he feels like is hindering his work, in God's mind, that difficulty is making Paul's faith and his work better. So I want you to think about this. If you deal with some kind of helpless, hopeless, they can't cast this demon out in your life. Have you ever stopped to think about that what you're dealing with, if you take James 1, the trying of our faith works patience, and you allow that to work in you. I'm not going to give up on God. Yeah, this is hard. It vexes me. I have my ups. I have my downs. I have my struggles. But I am not going to give up on God, because what I understand is that there is an eternal joy, a spiritual joy. There is a confidence that I have that endures anything, and maybe it will help me help somebody else. Because that's exactly what Paul deals with in 2 Corinthians chapter 13. Difficulties like this make us really selfish. I suspect this man in Mark chapter 9 had a hard time thinking about anything but his kid. But do you think that he had the ability to offer some insight to others who are dealing with difficulties? I want you to appreciate Christ can not only overcome whatever obstacle we face, but he can give us the kind of perspective and insight and confidence and hope that allows us not only to endure it, but to use it for the betterment. And that brings me to the last observation. And this, in my own mind, is why this miracle is here. And it really doesn't have anything to do with this child other than the reaction of the apostles. Third point is this. I think Jesus wants our faith to be stronger than any problem we face. And you see it in two circumstances. And here's the first one. In verse 17, when he asks the scribes what they're discussing, and the father cries out, I brought my child to your disciples, and they couldn't cast this demon out. Look at verse 19. Do you see Jesus' reaction? O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? My marginal reading says, and this is the way we would say it, how long do I have to put up with you? Bring him to me. Who's Jesus talking about there? Do you think it's the man who brings his child to Jesus and they can't cast him out, and Jesus looks at the man and says, You faithless man, how long am I going to have to put up with people like you? I don't think that's who he's talking about. I think he's talking about his apostles. Because his apostles have seen Jesus do all kinds of things. And they themselves have done all kinds of things. They've been sent out. They've cast out demons. In fact, a couple of chapters later, when they come back from one of their journeys that Jesus sends them on, they are impressed. Even the demons are subject to our. Now, but on this occasion, for whatever reason, their faith wasn't strong enough. And I think that's the point. Their faith wasn't strong enough. Why wasn't it? I don't know. Maybe it's the big crowd gathered around. Maybe it's the scribes that are just pounding on them. Maybe the demon did the same thing to them that the demon did to Jesus. Bring the boy here. And when the boy gets there, what does the demon do? And Jesus is not there. And Peter, James, and John are not there. You wonder if they looked around and Philip looked over at Thomas and said, "Hey, you got this one." Do you reckon any of them kind of backed up and go, "Hey, I don't know what to do with this"? And Jesus comes down, and he's just frustrated with them. Bill read from the chapter previous, which I wrote down wasn't Bill's fault. Did a wonderful job reading the wrong passage, Bill. But it is a passage that benefits here because in that passage, Jesus has warned his apostles about the leaven. Beware, he says, the leaven of the Pharisees. And their reaction to that is, well, it's because we hadn't taken any bread. And it's clear that Jesus gets frustrated with them. What do you mean you haven't taken bread? Did you not just see I fed thousands of people? Don't you think if bread was the issue, I could take care of that? He gets frustrated with these guys, and I'll tell you why. Because they were not manifesting the kind of faith that they should have given the evidence. So there's your question. And maybe the reason this is here, because that statement is in all three of the gospel accounts. Are we a faithless generation, folks, in spite of all that we've seen and watched and read and studied in our lives? Does the Lord get frustrated with us? Because rest assured, God can become frustrated with His people. He's done it before. There are ample evidences of it. Don't think He can't be frustrated with you and I. And you say, but my problems are too big. No, they are not. Not for God. And if the only way that you think God cares about you is if it fixes all your problems, then you are missing what it is that God is offering. The man who brings the child is the other example. He asks Jesus, if you can do anything. Jesus' replies, what do you, if I can do anything, if you can do anything, if you can have faith. And what's the man's reaction? I believe you can do this. Your disciples could, but I believe you can. And if my faith is lacking, help me. Well, that's the disposition God wants. That's the people we are supposed to be. But in our case, we have the great heroes that God talks about in Hebrews 11. We have the author and finisher, the pioneer of our faith. And what do we learn about faith from Jesus? Jesus endured injustice and difficulty, the likes that you and I will never know. I promise you. Well, I probably shouldn't promise, but I think it's safe. So I promise you, nobody's going to scourge you and crucify you because they think you're the Son of God in your life. It's not going to happen. But Jesus endured that. Do you think He could sympathize with, hey, this isn't fair? Satan is exercising power and I can't do anything about it and I'm helpless and it's hopeless. But you know what came out of Jesus' faith? Out of the crucifixion? Redemption. And there's no telling what can come out of the difficult circumstances that you and I face in our life. If God could make redemption out of crucifixion, what can He do with our issues? So here's my admonition as we finish. Do what you're asked to do. Do it with every bit of passion and zeal that you can muster in your life. Whatever it is that God has His people to do, do it. Whatever sacrifices you are asked to make it. Well, whatever effort you can make for others, whatever service you can be to this church, whatever influence you can be in this world, whatever you have to do to be holy, do that. Is it going to fix all your problems? Nope. Probably not. Because there are demons that you and I can't cast out on our own. But we serve a God who has only to command for everything in this universe to obey, to up to. And there will come a time when God not only will rectify every injustice, but He will reward us in ways that you and I cannot even imagine. God help our unbelief. And you and I had best be careful with our most difficult problems. Because God can become frustrated at our unbelief when we have all the evidence of His care and His love and His concern and His provision and His protection that He could possibly muster. That's what His revelation's for. And nothing that you and I will ever face will be able to overpower that. So, I read this, and it's a curiosity, and I'm sure there are other reasons that this passage is here, but I know a lot of people that are kind of in the circumstance that this guy was. Why is this happening? What do I do? I can't find any relief. And what did he find? Well, I can put my faith in God. And God can deliver me, and ultimately God will deliver me, so I'm just going to keep on trusting. Thanks for your attention. If you're subject to the invitation, we invite your response while we stand and sing.